Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Eric Cuellar, Associate Professor of Counseling and CLEEO Coordinator at Orange Coast Community College. And I'm very honored to have all of you attend the CLEEO Summit 10.0. We have a very special guest today. We have Mr. Luis Valdez. Mr. Valdez is the recipient of the National Medal of Arts Award that he received from President Barack Obama. It is the highest award that the United States government awards to artists and patrons of the arts. Mr. Valdez is a film director, playwright, and he's also known as a cultural icon of the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement, and working alongside Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez and supporting the United Farm Workers Movement. Mr. Valdez today will provide a presentation. He's going to share with us the trajectory of his career and also of an upcoming book that he's having published. So with having said that, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Valdez. And thank you, Mr. Valdez, for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Eric. It is my pleasure and honor to be able to address you and your community. We're very fond of Orange Coast College and have had a certain amount of history with the campus. Back in 1972, El Teatro Campesino hosted the third Chicano Theater Festival in the 1970s. We had a number of them at different campuses throughout the state and eventually other states into Texas and even Mexico City. But the first few that we had were fundamental because these were the founding stones of the whole Chicano theater movement and in some ways, very much a part of the Chicano movement in general, because we dealt with social issues, with the issues of our time that unfortunately remain with us, racism, the whole question of Chicano studies on many, many campuses, the war in Vietnam, it went on and on and on. And so these teatros spontaneously appeared over the 1970s. We went from one, which was El Teatro Campesino back in 1965, to more than 70 groups, by the time we got to Mexico City in 1974. So it was quite an experience to come to Orange Coast and to host the third festival there. And so it is my pleasure to be back on campus virtually now to address the campus and to see what's been happening ever since then. Of course, the world has changed considerably, especially technologically, but in other ways, socially, it hasn't changed at all. So many of the concerns that we were expressing back in the 1970s are still with us and will be with us, I think, for some foreseeable future. We need to be able to address these again and again until we can find some kind of balance. Ultimately, the issue is justice. As we've seen in the news daily these days, the whole question of justice, social justice, is still very much with us, whether we're talking about police violence or whether we're talking about what's being taught on campuses and schools. As to the whole question of ethnic studies, for instance, which is being challenged by certain sectors in the academic community. All of this relates to some of the basic themes that I have dealt with in my work, not only as a playwright, but also as a college professor over the years. I've never stopped teaching. I've been teaching since 1968. I taught, I was the beginning of the Chicano Studies department at Fresno State back in 1968. And I think it was one of the first Chicano Studies courses taught in the state. But I taught a class called La Raza, and there were so few elements, there's some materials to work with at the time that I had to Xerox, pages out of books and scrap together really the materials that I needed in order to fill out a syllabus, of reading materials for my students. In any case, we launched that class called La Raza, and the department became La Raza in 1968. And it was the beginning of Chicano studies throughout the state. Uh, it led to a confrontation when a new college president came in 1970, and the whole department was fired. They said that we were not, we were distorting history, that we were altering things, that we were not legitimate, and so forth. Arguments that you can still hear echoed here and there. But ironically, I was rehired to teach at UC Berkeley. So it was a step up for me to go from Fresno State to UC Berkeley, where I taught again in the Chicano Studies department. And eventually ended up at UC Santa Cruz, and in the late 90s became one of the founding professors of CSU Monterey Bay when they converted Fort Ord into one of the state universities. And I was able to found my own institute for Teledramatic Art and Technology, already anticipating some of the changes that seem to be apparent now. What we're doing right now is we're streaming. Of course, we're through Zoom, we are able to talk to each other, and many theater companies are availing themselves of this technology to be able to present their plays virtually. Well, that is something that we were anticipating back in the late 90s with my Institute of Teledramatic Art and Technology. In any case, all of this was an extension of the work that I had begun with the Teatro Campesino back in 1965 on the picket lines of the Delano grape strike. I went to Cesar Chavez and pitched him an idea of a theater up by and for farm workers. And he said, well, there's no money to do theater. There are no actors in Delano. There's no stage. There isn't even any time to rehearse. We're on the picket line night and day. Do you still want to do it? And I said, of course, Cesar, what an opportunity. Because I was tapping into the spirit of the movement that he and Dolores Huerta had begun. And I figured that this was one way to mainline, to go directly to the heart of the issue, which was to the need for us to state our position, to state our beliefs, and to state our convictions in some public forum. And this huelga, as it turned out, again, it was a small strike, well, the biggest strike that we had seen in the San Joaquin Valley since the 30s. But in terms of the country, it was way out in California. Nobody knew anything until it began to agitate cross country through the national boycott. And of course, it became a whole movement that galvanized the whole Chicano and Latino community in the United States. And what that did is that propelled the teatro directly into the main line. Within 2 years of our founding on the picket lines, we were in New York and performing at the Newport Folk Festival and in Greenwich Village. And so it launched also in that way the theater movement, and it launched the whole Chicano arts movement. So all of that comes from increased and very direct and active political activity and creativity. But it's all motivated by certain basic beliefs. I mentioned the idea of social justice. What is it that we seek? And what we're ultimately all seeking is a question of balance. And this is it's almost a cosmic question. What is balance? Our ancient ancestors, the Maya, had a myth that they subscribed to in their culture and in their way of life. And it was called four roads, that you're not a complete human being until you travel all of the four roads: the black road, the white road, the yellow road, and the red road. Now, they had very specific meaning for each of these colors in each of these directions, but we can interpret them in any way, our own way in our time, racially or culturally or geographically, because it seems like it's true to the description of the globe itself. The black road, of course, is not just African Americans, but all of the roots of our humanistic culture coming from Africa. The white road, it can be anywhere from Europe to Asia to the Middle East. It's there. The yellow road can be all of Asia. And the red road is all of Native America, if you interpret it culturally. But the point is that you cannot be completely human and sophisticated until you've traveled all of the roads. And our Mayan ancestors suspected this within their own confines in America. And what all this means is that the search for social justice that we seek is really a search for human balance, that we all need to be able to balance each other, and that we all need each other ultimately, that we need to express our consciousness through an understanding of the other people on earth. And unfortunately, for the last 500 years, due to the colonization of the world by the European powers, we have lived in a world that is completely out of balance, that the privilege and the power has gone basically to the white road, to the white people, to white supremacy. And Black people, of course, have been enslaved, and red people have been decimated. And yellow people, have had to struggle for their own survival, even though the cultures of Asia are the oldest on planet Earth. And so we are in a world that is still in turmoil, trying to seek its balance. And Chicano studies came along as a way to try to deal with our own sense of imbalance as Chicanos, because we didn't know who we were. We were born into this country and we were told, well, you're immigrants, you're nobody. And where we live, of course, used to be Mexico. It used to be native land, but it was taken over very directly during the Mexican War between the United States and Mexico in 1848. And we were left without a definition as to who we were. And a lot of our people really are lost between nationalities. They don't know whether they're Mexican or they don't know whether they're Americans. And of course, our young people way back in the 20th century faced this dilemma, and they started calling themselves Chicanos, as a way of identifying themselves. And they became pachucos in the streets of Los Angeles in order to defy the authorities and to express their own sense of being and their own sense of identity. And that led to other problems, of course, which led to the Sleepy Lagoon case and the Zoot Suit riots and police cracking down on gangs, which continue to this day. There's still a lot of confusion about as to who we are. This search for balance, this search for human balance continues. The Chicano movement arose as a need to try to counter this imbalance that we felt in our lives. We had to define ourselves. We had to define ourselves in terms of who we were in this country. We knew that some of us, our parents, our grandparents had been Mexicans coming from Mexico, but what did that mean inside the United States? When we encountered a culture that seemed to despise, our people. And historically, not so long ago, they were lynching Mexicans, in the streets of Los Angeles and throughout the towns of California and the Southwest, all the way to Texas. And so we were, recipients of the same hatred that afflicted Black people and affected Native Americans. And so we had to find a solution to this. And the only way that we could really understand this, at my estimation, is by understanding our own history, understanding a total view, a total perspective of our history as to who we are and where the balance needs to be. And what we have is an ongoing narrative that's been imposed on the world. It's the go west young man narrative. It's westward movement. It's manifest destiny. This is what has affected us directly for a couple of 100 years since this part of Mexico became the Southwest of the United States. And so our challenge to find balance is to try to understand the meaning of our own history. And the Chicano movement tried to address these things, not just politically, but culturally as well. And Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers was the spark that set off the need to find economic justice from the bottom up, because farm workers were wage slaves, basically still are. And they did some of the hardest jobs that there are, and yet they were the least paid. And so the only solution that seemed palpable at the time was a union, a strong union where we could come together and strike and demand better wages and better contracts. And that's what the Delano grape strike was all about, not just for Mexicans, as it turned out, but also for the Filipino farm workers who were in the same boat that we were. And what remained of the African-American workers that had come from the South, and the Okies, the stragglers, that were left from the 30s. So it was the question of economic justice and to find economic balance. It is a struggle that continues to this day because farm workers are still out there, even in the midst of the pandemic. They're out there picking fruit and food that is feeding the rest of the nation, regardless of the dangers and regardless of the death really that there's been as a result of exposure to the virus out there in the workplace. The union was the beginning of a social movement that extended into the schools very quickly because students were very sympathetic and supportive of the huelga. And so this spread to the campuses back in the 1960s, and Orange Coast included. There was a lot of activism. And the demand for Chicano studies really was a demand to try to reinterpret our history. The narrative that we all get, the narrative of with the Western movement and white supremacy, is something that is perpetuated not just in the schools through the history books that we're all taught with, but also through the movies, through the general popular culture that is American culture. It exists again to this day. Unfortunately, I mean, the Western was one of the most popular of the forms that Hollywood produced, but it was a form that was absolutely deadly to Mexicans and to Indians and to Black people. It was white supremacy written in black and white with lightning, you know, as President Wilson talked about the birth of a nation. That's how he described the birth of the Ku Klux Klan. You know, it's history written with lightning in the movies. But this same lightning was striking every day, you know, in the Westerns that we all grew up with. It doesn't matter if it was Gene Autry or Lash LaRue or all those early Westerns, Roy Rogers. What was written and ingrained into these stories was the whole notion of white supremacy. And so if you saw any Mexicans at all in these movies, I mean, they were either bandits or they were dumb sidekicks, you know. And so this is a condition that continues to exist in Hollywood. In order to seek balance, we have to insist that the narrative must be changed. And the only way it is going to change is if we do some of the writing. You know, we have to become the screenwriters, we have to become the directors, we have to become the producers. And of course, with Zoot Suit, my play, I was able to jump into the mainstream, you know, with the filming of my play as a feature film. It wasn't easy. I mean, it's on Netflix now. You can see it actually any night now on Netflix. It's running again. But it's 40 years old now, you know, but it was a struggle to try to get my movie done because there was no budget for it. You know, we had been to Broadway and I thought that might you know, encourage some studios to take the risk, but they very few were willing until Ned Tannen, who was the president of Universal Pictures, called me into his office and said he'd like to help me make the movie. But he wanted me to shoot it on videotape. You know, they'd just done the Gong Show movie like that. And I said, well, it can't be done on videotape. I said, it'll look ridiculous. You blow that up to 35 millimeter, it'll look cheap, you know. And anyway, it was a struggle. Eventually, because he really wanted to help. So by going back and forth, we eventually, he gave me $1 million to try to film it and with 35 millimeter film. And so we shot it in 13 days at the Aquarius Theater where it had run for 10 months in Hollywood. And I had to think of a way to shoot this movie in 13 days for $1 million without having it look like, you know, like a failure. You know, I had to make it its own thing. And so if you look at the movie, you see what the solution is. It's a play within a movie within a movie, a play within a play within a movie within a movie. And Edward James Olmos, of course, had been starring as the Pachuco at the beginning of his career. So he did a sensational job of recreating the Pachuco on the big screen. It was his first big role on the big screen. And my brother, Daniel Valdez, who had been playing Henry Reina, accompanied him as Henry Reina, and they were co-stars in the movie. But then the whole original cast of Zoot Suit from the stage transferred into the movies. So what this movie became then is the entry point for a lot of the same Latino actors that you see today, the Chicano and / Latino actors. Some were Puerto Rican, some were Cuban, Americans all. And they made their entry into the movie business through Zoot Suit. So what that speaks to is the idea that sometimes social activism is what we need in order to open the doors. And so just like the way that the Pachuco takes his knife and cuts through the newspaper at the opening of the newspaper, the movie did the same thing. It kind of sliced through the celluloid and ripped its way into Hollywood with some of the talents that we continue to see to this day. We need more evidence of this kind of activity. Filmmakers have to have the courage to be able to speak from their own truth and to be able to take the challenge of doing something quickly. I had to shoot Zoot Suit in 13 days on $1 million budget, even though it was part of Universal Studios. It was this big studio Hollywood film. I think the studio spent more on the opening night, at the Cinerama Dome. They spent more on promoting the film that they did in production. But in any case, the film exists and anyone can see it for themselves. From there, there were other projects, but 5 or 6 years later, we ended up doing La Bamba. My brother and I were Daniel and I were in New York back in 1979 in his dressing room on opening night of La Bamba on Broadway. We had gone from LA, of course, to New York. It was the first time that a Chicano play had made it to Broadway. And we were in the Winter Garden, which is, a grand old house right there on Broadway. It's where My Fair Lady premiered way back on, back in the 50s. And Zoot Suit was on Broadway underneath this great big billboard that said Zoot Suit. I can show you a picture actually later on, of me and Cesar standing before this big billboard. But in any case, we were up on the second story dressing room, and it was opening night. And my brother and I were really pretty full of ourselves, thinking, oh, we made it to Broadway and we're doing the 40s. We'll need to come back and do the 50s. What can we do for the 50s? And as we asked ourselves at that exact moment, we heard music. And so we looked out the second story window down to 7th Ave, which is parallel with Broadway. And what we saw were mariachis. There were mariachis on there, and they were playing a song that answered our question, what can we do next? They were playing La Bamba. As it turned out, the president of Mexico had sent mariachis to serenade us on opening night on Broadway. And La Bamba then became the target, of our next project. It took 5 years for my brother Daniel to track down the family and essentially whatever materials there were for the story. But La Bamba became our next movie. But one thing leads to the other. You see, this is like in the effort to try to find balance, you have to watch your steps. But one thing grows organically out of the next one. It's all part of the same push, the same part of the activism that El Teatro Campesino represented way back on the picket lines. That propelled us to Zoot Suit, and Zoot Suit propelled us to La Bamba, and so forth. It propelled us in Chicano studies in the same way. My class way back in 1968 was put together with mimeograph materials, whatever I could find, short stories, whatever I could find that had been published. But eventually that led, once I was fired from Fresno State and went to Berkeley, then I was offered the opportunity to publish my teaching materials with Harper and Row, published my first anthology called Aslan. So all my teaching materials became the first anthology of Chicano literature. So one thing leads to the other. You get a push, you get a thrust going, and that's where some of your power comes. Once you begin to do stuff actively in search of balance, then it kind of begins to speak for itself and speaks to you directly in terms of what steps need to be taken. That's part of my advice to young people is the movement is really within as well as outside of yourself. It is not just the collective movement. It is the movement that you feel inside your own soul and inside your own heart to make change happen. And in some ways, the events and the conditions of your time define what steps you need to take, because it is an eternal question about whose narrative we're all kowtowing to. And this narrative of white supremacy, this narrative of westward expansion has to change. We've long since, I think, reached the point where now there's an Eastern movement, in a sense that the whole Western movement came to California, went all the way to Hawaii and even to the Philippines, and then came back. And now there is a movement that is headed east. And it is the brown people essentially beginning to reoccupy the whole country. Now, we're not taking it over, we're sharing it, again, because we're talking 4 roads here, that we need to be able to travel the red road, the yellow road, the black road, and the white road. If you want the brown road, mix all the colors, I mean, that's how you get brown, is you mix all the colors. And that's who brown people are. The human race is mostly brown, actually. If you could gather all of humanity and put them, in a big open area, like out in the Midwest, everybody get the whole human race together and stand it out. I'm telling you, the predominant color of the human race would be brown, various shades of brown. And so, but we're all colors. We go, even among Chicanos, we have blonde, blue-eyed Chicanos. I have them in my own family. We call them güeros, they're güeritos, but we don't love them any less because they're güeros. And the way we don't even, we don't discriminate against ourselves, because in the Chicano culture, we have the whole range from güeritos to negros, At one point when I was a kid, they used to call me negro, and when you're prieto, you're negra, mi negro. I mean, all of that was within the culture, because we are born, we Chicanos are born of a mestizaje. We've already faced the question of racial mixture. That's been with us for a long, long time. And what has emerged is the whole concept of a new concept of who the human being is. We come in all colors, we come in all sizes, but we're all human, and we all have the same basic human rights. Now, this is a narrative that needs to be emphasized, because in our time, we're struggling with the whole concept of what is right and what is good and what is beautiful and what is intelligent, and what is the future. And the future is multicolored. The future is multicultural. The future is a balance of the red road, the white road, the yellow road, and the red road. It's a balance. And we need to be able to travel all of these roads. And we need to get this narrative down, not only in our movies that are being made, in the novels that are being written, but also in the stories that are being told in the classroom and in our colleges. What is our history? What history are we teaching our young people? And how can they cope with their lives if they don't get the truth about themselves? The fact is that we're still, the open ends of human civilization are still being debated as to exactly when and how human civilization began. It is known that some of the oldest civilizations on Earth are in the Americas, and some of the oldest contributions are in the Americas. Why then are our people, Native Americans, native Latino Americans, if you will, being treated as if we're just strangers that just got here? We are America. But this is a narrative that has not been taught to our people. America are supposed to be those people that came from Europe, those immigrants. Now, I have nothing against European immigrants. I love European culture. I'm speaking in English. I've been to Europe. I enjoy it very much. What I don't like is the racism that says that only Europe is what is valuable, or that only Europe is what really embraces human intelligence. Human intelligence resides in every corner of the world, and it is a globe. So there are no corners. It is all, what goes around comes around. And we get genius from every area on Earth. And Asians, I think, have proven themselves that they're the oldest culture and that they have quite a bit to contribute. African Americans have contributed despite murder and despite oppression and slavery. They've been able to overcome. And I think the narrative there is one of immense human heroism that needs to be respected. And of course, African blood has entered Latin America, so we're all part African also, so that's part of our heritage. And Native Americans, again, have endured the decimation of white supremacy for 500 years. And yet, some of the oldest and most sophisticated cultures are in Native America. And so all of this needs to be taught. It needs to be balanced, because the power resides eventually in the incorporation of as many of these colors and as many of these directions as possible. If you really look at the law as a narrative in nature itself, diversity is not just the law of nature, it is also the way to power. That diversification is the key to survival. Diversification is the key to increased quality and increased efficacy. It is what makes really the cornucopia of Mesoamerica, of Mexico, one of the richest sources of food on planet Earth because of the diversity of its fruits and plants and vegetables and fauna and so forth, which has led to a very rich cuisine, that we're all very proud of and very fond of. But this is true of any culture. It's true of China. It's true of Europe. It's true. Diversity is what works. The more diverse you can be in your thinking, the more diverse you can be in your choices and in your tastes, the stronger you are, the more intelligent you are, the more conscious you are. So what is this insistence then on monoculture? Why this insistence on one single road, the white road? That is the way to weakness. That is the way to death. As a matter of fact, the white road, the color white among the Mayan culture was always associated with the north, with cold, with the death, with the land of our ancestors. You had to go south in order to find fecundity and fertility. So again, the narrative needs to speak to the world as it really is, not as one very privileged group would like it to be. We've all been hoodwinked into thinking, that we're lesser than we are if you are not white. We all have something to contribute. Like I said, we're all part white anyway, Again, I'm an Anglo because I've absorbed Anglo culture. I have no problem with that. I was an English major. I grew up, eating hamburgers and drinking Cokes like everybody else. I have no problem with that, but it didn't make me any less Mexicano. I stayed a Mexicano, They didn't make me any less willing to embrace rock and roll and rhythm and blues and jazz and everything African American. It just means that if you are really sophisticated and educated, then you understand how you are part of the human race. You understand how you are part of a natural balance created by a mind and a conscience that is universal and cosmic, and has known how to balance not just human beings, but also the trees and the plants and the insects. Everything works together to create the world that we live in. And we are understanding now how if we work with nature and allow it to achieve its own natural balance, we can solve problems of climate change and pollution and the poisoning of the water table. But it takes consciousness that is aware of the need for balance and diversity and multiplicity, in the way that we view the world. So the narrative, in other words, needs to continue to evolve and needs to continue to become more sophisticated as we go. I'm hoping that future works by American writers will embrace the complexity of America, the promise of America, because it represents the whole human race. That in the future, Chicanos will understand that they are continental Americans, that we didn't just get here. The United States came to us. We didn't come to the United States, that was later translated as, we crossed, the border crossed us. We didn't cross the border, but the United States came to us. We were incorporated into the United States by force, but we have learned across the generations to be able to integrate ourselves and to become effective, hardworking, loving Americans like everybody else, because being American is not a question of race. Being American means that you can be of any race. Being American means that you can speak any language. It means the universality of the human race. That's the promise of America. And so beware of the lie that limits you to just one viewpoint. Beware of the lie that diminishes your capacities as a complex human being to express your connection to the entire human race and the rest of nature. And so as a Chicano, then, I'm still looking forward to a future that will become richer and more complex and more creative as we go along, because people will learn to work with each other and to understand each other and to appreciate really what we all bring to the table. As a Chicano, I've always thought that our way to get into the mainstream here is to bring what we bring, And so when I was a kid, the Pachucos in our community were despised, There were people, even among Mexicanos, that thought the Pachucos were hoodlums. But I was a kid and I thought they looked heroic to me. So, eventually that ended up becoming Zoot Suit. You know, when I was a kid, the movie theaters were segregated. I grew up in Delano, California, way back. You know, it was a tiny little town for farm workers. You know, we had our Chinatown. I was born in a labor camp in Chinatown, basically. There were no Chinese, they were mostly Filipinos, but they called it Chinatown. But the fact is that the movie theater, the Delano Theater, was segregated. And the orchestra section in the middle was reserved for white people. And all of the rest of the people, the black people, the brown people, the Filipinos, the Mexicans, had to sit on the sides. And occasionally the Japanese sat in the middle. But basically everybody else was off to the sides. And so what happened is that back around 1948, there was a Pachuco in Delano that I got to know by the name of Cici. And Cici had been in the Navy. And so he came to the movies. He brought his girlfriend and went to the movies. And since he was serving his country, he was in his civvies, but he was still in the service. Since he was in serving his country, he felt he had a right to sit in the middle section. So he got his girlfriend and sat in the orchestra section. Well, the usher came and says, you can't sit here, because Cici was kind of dark and Indian looking. And so he says, well, who says I can't sit here? And he says, well, those are the rules. He says, I'm not leaving. So they called the manager, and the manager came and tried to get him to move. He still wouldn't move. So they called the police, and the police came and they took him. And all his friends looked and said, oh, Cici's in trouble, man. So they took Cici to the police station there in Delano, and they grilled him for a couple of hours. But, you know, there was no law that says he couldn't sit in the middle. It was all by custom. There was no law that said he was breaking. So they grilled him for 2 or 3, a couple hours, and made him feel bad and threatened him. But eventually they had to release him. So once he was released, all his friends were amazed. They said, wow, Cici got away with it. So the next weekend, Cici and all his friends went to the movies and sat in the middle section. And so what happened is that the Delano Theater was desegregated. You know, I was there. I saw this happen. I saw this happen across the whole San Joaquin Valley after that the movie theaters began to be desegregated. So way back then, that was in 1948. So in 1965, when I was on my way to Delano, I was back, I'd been living in San Francisco, and I was stopped in San Jose, and I saw my mom, and she says, oh, you're going back to Delano? And I said, yeah. She said, oh, you're going to work with Cici. And I said, Cici, is that Vato still around? And she says, he laughed. He says, mijo, don't you know who Cici is? Cici is Cesar Chavez. So Cici the Pachuco became Cesar Chavez, the apostle of nonviolence, and again, one of our greatest leaders. The fact is that Cici was standing up for his rights. And he used to say back in Delano during the grape strike, Cesar used to say some things that were very, very deep and very, very prophetic. He says, this strike isn't just about farm workers. If we win this strike, we're going to see people run for school boards. We're going to see people going to school. We're going to see the universities change. And, he was absolutely right, because the Delano grape strike in that sense was the root. It was building from the grassroots all the way up to the top. And so it was the beginning of a movement that would diversify America, that would find some social balance, that would find some diversity in America and keep it moving to a greater and more balanced society that we all need and we can strive for and need to work with as activists and as artists and as politicians. So my advice to young people is keep it up, keep moving. The Chicano movement has never ceased to be important. It continues to move. We may not call it the Chicano movement. Doesn't matter. Call it the movement for America. Call it the movement for a better and more just planet Earth. Call it a movie, a movie. Yeah, call it a movie also. Call it a movement, for the human race. That is what we're all part of. We are humanity on the move.
Thank you, Mr. Valdez. I'm truly amazed and honored of these words of wisdom, the wisdom of the ancients of our Mesoamerican cultures that you've shared. And, I'm so honored. And what I'd like to continue with in regards to the time that we have left with you, I'd like to go over the questions that I discussed with you. And I'd like to start off with question number 1, which is, what is your view on the role of community colleges and how they support the educational aspiration of Latinas and Latinos in America?
Well, in that sense, education, has to be stepped up. It has to be by gradual steps. And the idea of the community college is the first step that a lot of Chicanos need to take in order to get to state college or the universities or what have you. So they serve a critical and crucial role in the education of our people. Also, they're close to home. Community colleges are really part of the community. And one of the things that's just characteristic of Chicanos and Latinos in general is that we like to be close to our communities. We like to be close to our families. The idea of going cross country, if it were possible to go to Harvard and Yale, all the more power to them, but most Chicanos need to take the step with consideration for their families. And so the community college comes to play in that way. It is close to home, and yet it is a definite step that takes Chicanos onto higher education. So more power to the community college. It is where some of the most basic kind of teaching takes place. And I think El Teatro Campesino has worked with many community colleges over the years in order to enhance the educational program. So more power to you.
Thank you, Mr. Valdez. The second question is, as the founder of Chicano Theater and Film, what consejo or advice would you provide to a Chicano aspiring to become a screenwriter, playwright, and/or film director?
Well, the idea is to connect with your stories, right? Is the narrative is really important. You write from the heart in so many different ways. There's a technique, obviously. There's a technique to screenplay structure. And the more you know about the process of filmmaking, the more you understand the needs of a screenplay. But the most basic originating point of a screenplay is the heart. It has to touch your heart. You can't get a film done well, I think, without involving your heart. And I would never get involved in a film project if I didn't feel it in my heart, the need to do that. So tell the stories that you absolutely need to tell is what I'm telling the young people. Tell the stories from your point of view. Everything that happens to you in your life can be turned into the narrative, that speaks to the world. When I wrote my screenplays, they were based on experiences that I had, had in my life. And these are the moments that play best, on a screen, that are most human and the deepest, and yet the most sincere and honest moments of a film.
Thank you. Question number 3 is, as a recipient of the National Medal of Arts Award, in recognition of your contribution to the arts, what specific work in your career are you most proud of and why?
Well, I think, again, it's all good. I embrace it all. And like I say, one thing is connected to the other. It's a continuum. It isn't a single product. It's a process more than anything else. What I am proud of is that through El Teatro Campesino and my work as a playwright, my community and others, as it turns out, not just Chicanos, but other communities have learned the importance and the power of this kind of basic dramatic expression. Before I wrote my plays, there was no such thing as Latino theater. There were no Mexican-American playwrights. It's pretty clear that I was the first in that regard. There was a woman named Josefina Isigli, a Polish descent, who was born in Mexico but lived in Texas. And she had her plays produced in the University of North Carolina back in the teens and in the 20s, and she wrote in English, but she wrote about Mexican subjects. I consider her to be, one of my antecedents. But she didn't come directly from the barrio, although she lived in contact with the barrio. But generally speaking, the my experience as an example as a playwright has led other Latinos to embrace the idea of playwriting or screenwriting or movie making. And they say, well, if he can do it, I can do it. And that's the proudest thing for me. We learn by example and we teach by example. And so that's the basis. The Medal of the Arts is important because it gives us national resonance. It's a national spotlight, but it's not the publicity or the honor or the glory, that is the most important thing. The most important thing is that it is empowerment to a whole community, a national community. And of course, it must be the empowering of young people, the kids that are tomorrow's artists.
Thank you, Mr. Valdez. I have two more questions for you. I think this one's the one that I'm most curious to hear about. The fourth question is, what untold story would you like to develop and share with American society for the big screen?
Well, there are a lot of them. At the present time, I do have a screenplay I've worked with one of my sons, Kinan, and his friend Akira Bach. And it's the screenplay based on my play Valley of the Heart, which is was most recently produced at the Center Theater Group in Los Angeles in 2018, 2019. It is a love story between the daughter of a Japanese American farmer, an Issei first generation immigrant farmer, a Nisei daughter, and the oldest son of a Mexican American sharecropping family on the same ranch. It's set in 1941, just before World War II, before Pearl Harbor, but it deals with the experience of the Japanese family when they are sent to Heart Mountain concentration camp in Wyoming, and how the Mexican family takes over the ranch to keep it alive for them while they are incarcerated, while they are imprisoned. This roughly parallels the experience of my family when I was a kid, because I was a child when my dad took over the ranch of his Japanese American employer back in 1941, 42. And it is a story that still needs to be told. That kind of cross-minority love story is one that you never really see too often. And yet it's so common in California history, especially the relationship between Japanese and Mexicans, or Filipinos and Mexicans, or Black people and Mexicans. I mean, all of that is something that is just part of our living history. And so this movie is one that I hope to get made as soon as we can all get back on the back lot, so to speak. Things are still tight because of the coronavirus, but we're moving it along, and hope to get it to the big screen in due time.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing. Be definitely excited about seeing
this.
It's
called Valley of the Heart, in case you see it advertised. Okay.
All right. Hopefully we can screen it at Orange Coast College in the near future.
It would be nice.
Definitely. Fifth question that I have is regarding social responsibility. You have stated that, quote, "The injustices of the world are like weeds. If you do nothing, they'll choke your whole garden," unquote. What is an injustice that requires our attention as a society, and how would you like to envision our society in the future?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious, that the overriding injustice that we're all in this country working with is racism. I mean, it's race is an artificial construct. It doesn't really exist. There is no such thing as race. This is something that's been imposed on our way of life by people that really benefit from it. That's not to say there isn't a diversity in terms of the human race, in terms of what we all look like and where we come from. But race per se is not real. And we need to teach our young people about the complexity of the human race and the unity, the commonality of the human race, that we're all human. One of the reasons that we're having such trouble, with police departments is because anybody can become a cop, without having to go through race training, without in any way being expected to develop sensibilities so that the trigger hit, the trigger figure doesn't go for the gun immediately. Once you see somebody that down deep inside you fear and you disrespect. I wonder all the time what people really do tell. What stories do they tell themselves when they're with their friends? And these are the stories that undermine certain races or undermine us as a society as a whole. We need to develop a greater respect for the human being, who we are, and what our potential is and what we can contribute. In order to better understand this, then we need to be honest about our own history. Who has contributed to science? Who has contributed to medicine? Who has contributed to the arts? And if we really told the truth, you'd see that everybody has brought their genius. Everybody has brought their creativity into the mix and that have not received credit. And I'm talking also about women. Women have not been acknowledged for the tremendous contribution, the essential contribution that women have made, and not just as mothers, although that's fundamental, but as creators, as leaders, as scientists, as spiritual people. Why don't we have women priests? What is this business? That only males can be priests. That's something. I mean, I was born Catholic, raised Catholic. I call myself a Roman Catholic, But the fact is that I'm offended that the Catholic Church does not acknowledge women as priests. There's nothing ungodly about women. On the contrary, the divine element is there in women. And we recognize it in Mexican culture because a lot of us worship and celebrate La Virgen de Guadalupe precisely because she represents the feminine divine principle in the cosmos. Our Aztec and Mayan ancestors acknowledged it immediately. There were goddesses, there were female ometeo. The name of God means to God because God was both male and female. And so in that sense, the oppression of women is something that needs to be overcome. And the appreciation of women as complete equal human beings to men is something that must be embraced. And men must not be intimidated so that they stop giving because women, are acknowledged. The better part of us really is the feminine part of us. And the better part of women is really their masculine side. So it needs to be balanced. It needs to find a re-education in our homes and in our private lives so that we can balance each other in terms of sex and gender and human behavior.
Gracias. Wonderful. Thank you for these words of wisdom. I want to provide in these last few minutes, I wanted to extend to you the invitation to accept from the CLEEO project at Orange Coast College your induction into the CLEEO Hall of Fame, where you will be, if you accept this honor, we would be so, humbled and thankful that you'll be joining Dolores Huerta in the OCC CLEEO Hall of Fame. So I wanted to extend that invitation if you would accept this honor from the Orange Coast College CLEEO project and our campus community.
Well, you honor me, Eric. Thank you very much, and the entire staff and faculty at the Orange Coast. Absolutely, yes. I'm in any way that can help, to inspire other young people, your students. Absolutely, absolutely.
And it's wonderful and honor that we have you returning and joining us from your first visit to us at Orange Coast College in 1972. And to have you here is just wonderful. It's beautiful. And we look forward to keeping this relationship open in the Esta Casa es Su Casa, Orange Coast College.
May I share some images with you, Eric?
Yes, absolutely.
Let me share the screen here. These people can see some of the work, and I'll just do a little slideshow here for everybody as we go out. Okay, so here it is. And I'd mentioned Cesar. This is when we were, I hope you can see that. Before Broadway there, this is the Winter Garden Theater. But actually, El Teatro Campesino started a lot more humbly. It was on the picket lines of the Delano grape strike way back in 1965. And this is El Teatro Campesino today in San Juan Bautista. It's an old packing shed. And we like the poetic justice of it, the fact that, again, our resources did not need to be any more sophisticated than they ever were in order to get things done. But this is a school. This is where we teach teatro, and there's a whole theater in there that you can't see. We can seat 150 people, but we have our offices and our workshop space, and we have workshops over the years. Not at the moment because we are, in fact, of course, in lockdown because of the coronavirus. But there it is. Over the years, we've had a lot of different images. We've worked with Diablos and Calaveras, and these are the creatures, of our culture. And this is El Fin del Mundo. These are from tours way back in the 80s. And this is Diane Rodriguez down here, who went on to become the associate artistic director of the Taper. She passed away last year, unfortunately, but we all remember her vividly. This was her in the 70s, way back when. This is my wife and compañera Lupe. We've been married for 51 years. And this is our wedding way back in 1969. And this is us today. And so that's just a little shot, of some images of our life together. You cannot do this alone. El Teatro Campesino is a family of families, and we are proud that many of our members, our core company members, are still with us, although we lost a couple of people due to the coronavirus over the last year. So I'm going to stop sharing, and here I am. Okay.
Excellent. Gracias. Thank you. And felicidades. Congratulations. Es una pareja. Qué tan guapa y guapo están ustedes dos. Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you for sharing. It's wonderful. I just wanted to extend to you our deepest thanks as a campus and you joining us today. And if you had some final closing words of wisdom for us to share so that we can take this to our hearts and minds and travel, the four roads.
The four roads. Life is a spiral, man. That's the power of zero in the Mayan culture. In my book, the name of the book is the Theater of the Sphere, The Vibrant Being. It will be out in July in paperback and in hardback by Routledge Press. It'll be available, of course, for academic use. It's aimed at universities and colleges, but it's not just a history of the teatro. It is also the practical working plans and exercises that we use in order to train actors. And these are not just actors in the theater, but actors in life. That's really important. El buen actor y el mal actor are actors in life, not just on the stage. And so my book, I hope, will be useful in that regard. And it'll certainly be available to Orange Coast, for classroom use out of Routledge Press and other universities. So I hope that you can find it useful.
No, for sure. I look forward to having it as one of the course adoptions of textbooks for my course and required reading. I'm looking forward to it. Ansioso to read this upcoming text that you have for us this year in the summer. So definitely have my summer reading. Well,
wonderful.
Again, muchas gracias. Thank you. It's an honor to have you with us, Mr. Luis Valdez. And thank you for all your contributions that you've contributed to our society, our global society, American society. And that we all can journey together throughout these four roads, and hopefully fulfill the cosmic vision that brings humanity, in touch with our greatest abilities and capacities that I'm sure we have. And thank you, and muchas gracias. And we hope to have you again soon at Orange Coast Community College.
Thank you, Eric. Gracias a
Gracias.
todos.
Hasta luego.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.